Today we're going to continue talking about parallel lines and transversals, but we're kind of going to do the converse. Before we knew that the lines were parallel, and so we were able to talk about the angle relationships that are formed because they were parallel. And in this lesson, we're going to talk about how do the angle relationships show or prove that the lines are parallel. So what we know so far from previous lessons is that if we have two lines that are intersected by a transversal, and those lines are parallel, then we have all these five special relationships. And those are the five special relationships that we talked about in the last lesson. And so I did mention the word converse earlier, not too long ago. And these are basically five if-then statements that I sort of I shortened. I made all the Q's. I wrote all the Q's here. So my P is that two lines are intersected by a transversal and they're parallel. And then I have a bunch of Q's. Alternate interior angles are congruent, alternate exterior angles are congruent, same side interior supplementary, same side exterior supplementary, corresponding congruent. So that means like if we know two lines are parallel, then we know all these Q's. But the converse is also true. That if we know two lines are intersected by a transversal and one of these things happens, so now these things turn into P's, they're part of the if. So if we know that two lines are intersected by a transversal and alternate interior angles are congruent, then we know the two lines are parallel. So it works both ways, and if you remember, that means that we could write a biconditional here that if two lines are intersected by a transversal and are parallel if and only if alternate interior angles are congruent, or if and only if alternate exterior angles are congruent, and so on and so forth. What you'll notice I haven't talked about are vertical angles and linear pairs. We can see them when we have parallel lines and transversals, but vertical angles and linear pairs do not prove that two lines are parallel. And let me show you why. If I have two lines just like that, clearly not parallel because they would intersect if I extended them, and then I have a transversal, another line that intersects both of them. I'm still going to see angle pairs that are vertical. For example, that angle and that angle right there. They're vertical and they're congruent. But what we know is that these two lines are not parallel. I'm going to see linear pairs, that angle and that angle. If I added their angle measures together, they would add to 180. Clearly, these two lines are not parallel. So you need to be careful. It's these five relationships here that go along with parallel lines. Vertical angles and linear pairs will exist in the figures, and they might become helpful, but they don't prove that two lines are parallel. So these pictures that I'm going to show you should look similar to what we've practiced, but we're just kind of thinking about this in the opposite direction. Notice I don't know yet that U and V are parallel, though I'm pretty confident they are. What we want to know is what value of question mark here would make U and V parallel. Well, the first thing we should establish is what angle pair do I have here. And so I have one that's interior to the parallel or to possible parallel lines, and I have one exterior. But they are each in the same location in that bank of four angles that we've talked about in the past. And so those are corresponding angles. And we should know that corresponding angles, if they're congruent, then the lines will be parallel. So if this angle was 63 degrees, then U and V would be parallel. Same idea here. Both of my angles, 122 and question mark, are on the interior of U and V. They're on alternate sides of the transversal, and so therefore they're alternate interior angles. If those two angles are congruent, then we'll know U and V are parallel, so question mark needs to be 122 degrees. I got one more here. I have angles that are interior to U and V. They're on the same side of the transversal this time. We know that if same side interior angles are supplementary, or they add to 180, then our lines must be parallel. So we're just going to subtract this 127 from 180 and get 53. So it's kind of the same idea. We're going in reverse though. In one way we start with parallel lines and we can find an angle measure. The other way we find the angle measure that would make those lines parallel. So, and again, we can throw in some algebra to the mix here. So I have alternate interior angles, and so if they're congruent, then my lines will be parallel. So I can set up an equation, and I can solve that equation for x. So I'm going to subtract 1 on both sides and get 22x equals 44. Divide by 22 on both sides and get x to be 2. So I'm skipping some steps here, hoping that you know what I'm doing when I subtract 1 and divide by 22. I'll do a couple more. Here I have same side interior, so in order for my lines to be parallel, these need to add to 180. So I'll add them up and say they're equal to 180. I'll combine like terms. Subtract 126 from both sides. And then divide by 6 and get that x is 9. So when x is 9, these two angles will add to 180, and u and v will be parallel lines. So let me do one more. Here I have alternate exterior angles, alternate sides of the transversal, exterior on the exterior of u and v. And so alternate exterior angles we know, or we should know by now, are congruent, and so their measures will be equal, and so we'll say they're equal. I'll subtract 19 from both sides. And I'll divide both sides by 7 and find that x is 12. So this looks like it's probably almost exactly like the last lesson, but it's important to think sort of in the converse way, that here we're trying to make the angles either be equal or add to 180, so that that relationship forces the lines to be parallel. So rather than put the problems here, I'm going to put them, I'm just going to have them pop up for you. So make sure you watch all the way to the very end of the lesson so that you see the questions and you can answer them.